Hello and welcome to this first video in the series that I will be doing on the Bodhicaryavatara. We're starting with chapter 7 and this video deals with verse 1. I apologize in advance for what is likely to be a certain clunkiness. I'm doing this without any specialist training in presentation and on my ordinary computer equipment at home. Hopefully the material itself will be less amateurish than the mode of presentation of it. You should all have the annotated version that I prepared, which I'll call up onto the screen for you. A link will have been given to all of those watching this before it goes public. Sorry, yeah, here's a bit more clunkiness. There we are. This is the TypeScript, the analysis that you should have, which I'm putting out in both Word form and PDF. And I'll give you explanations as we go along what the various rubrics, indentations, asterisks, and that kind of thing mean. There will also be, hopefully by the time this is published, a separate sheet explaining abbreviations and various notations that we use. So I will go into it and I will share with you my iPad screen. So what you will have, it's probably useful if you have with you as you're watching this the TypeScript, the Word document that you can see on the shared screen. And separately now, on shared screen, I will, as we go along, be making manuscript notes on the Notability app on an iPad, which I will also be sharing with you as a PDF document after the end of each session, or as each video is made public. So at the same time will the Notability app notes. What I will do, I will first recite the verse in Sanskrit slowly twice, and then we'll go into the analysis of it. A note on my own pronunciation, how I pronounce it. I do my best, as a native English speaker, I do my best to reproduce the pronunciation of Indian Brahmins in their recitation of Sanskrit, because that is highly likely to be the most authentic form of pronunciation. If you are interested in hearing Sanskrit and Vedic, of course, recited by Brahmins, the internet is awash with any number of YouTube presentations on how it's done. So there's no shortage of very, very high quality material showing you how it is pronounced by the northern Indian Brahmins, or by all Indian Brahmins. I've often been asked, well, how do we know how Sanskrit was pronounced? Well, the answer is we've probably got a much better, almost certainly have a much better idea about the pronunciation of Sanskrit back in ancient times than pretty much any other language. And that is because the oral tradition, the recitation of the Vedas, the earlier form of Sanskrit, has been preserved with very great care by the Brahmins over millennia and still is. And as to the question, well, have they preserved it correctly? The answer to that is highly likely yes, for two reasons. Firstly, we have the mighty linguist and grammarian Panini. Panini wrote around 500 BC his grammatical analysis of Vedic, and he put that into what we now know as Sanskrit, which is the refined or composed language, and not only dealing with the language and grammar and syntax, but also with the pronunciation of it. So there are numerous areas in Painini where he gives us a pretty scientifically accurate description of the position of the tongue, the mouth, the vocal organs in pronunciation. But not only that, in India to this day, if you listen to Brahmins chanting the Vedas, or indeed to modern Indians pronouncing Sanskrit, reciting Sanskrit, all the way from Kashmir down to the deepest south, the pronunciation will be virtually identical. And these are among communities of Brahmins who have had no contact with each other for millennia, who have retained to this day virtually identical forms of pronunciation. So for these reasons, we can be fairly certain that when we hear an educated Brahmin reciting Sanskrit, it is authentic and almost certainly sounds very much as it did a couple of thousand years ago, and even possibly 3,000 years ago. So what I will be doing here is my best to reproduce that. Here we go. I will recite verse 1 of chapter 7 slowly twice, and then we will analyze it. Evam kshamo bhajed viryam virye bodhiryata sthita nahi viryam vina punyam yatha vayum vina gati. And again. Evam kshamo bhajed viryam virye bodhiryata sthita nahi viryam vina punyam yatha vayum vina gati. Before I go into the analysis of the verse, a word on the word viryam, and indeed a general word on translation. When you're translating, particularly from a text like this in an ancient language into English, a word-by-word translation will never cut it. It will never get it fully right. It's an approximation at best. That's why the only really useful translation is a heavily annotated translation which explains the semantic range of the words as we go along. Viryam, for example, you'll see the note I've done on page 2 of my analysis. It's an abstract noun from vira, man, a special, eminent or heroic person. Virya originally meant manliness, then by extension energy, power, vigor. So the semantic range of the word virya is something that we'll learn as we go along. Hopefully we'll learn a lot about it in the course of this chapter, because this chapter is about virya. But do bear in mind that where a single word translation is called for, as in, for example, the title of this chapter, which is, I'm sorry, I was interrupted there. My iPad thought I was asking it a question and interrupted me to say that it didn't understand my question. So back to where we were. Sometimes we just have to do a one-word translation, and if you're just doing a regular translation of a text into English, that's how it is. We're translating the title of chapter 7 as the perfection of vigor, which is how many translators have done it. But just do bear in mind that when we look at the English word vigor, we mustn't run away with it. What do we mean by vigor? That's what he's talking about. Well, no. The word is virya, and in Sanskrit, virya has a certain range of meaning. Vigor partially gets it, so does energy, so does effort. All of these words partially get it, but none of them will totally get it, which is essentially the purpose of what we're doing now. We're exploring this text in the original Sanskrit to see what it really means. So I will now share my iPad screen with you so that you can see the notes as I do them. As I say, these notes that you see me making as we go along, they will at the end of this be converted into a PDF and made available on the same platform that this video and my Word document with the analysis of this chapter are made available. So here we go. I will share a screen. There we are. Let me move myself out of the way a bit. There we are. As I say, sorry again about the clunkiness. I don't have the benefit of expert technical assistance yet. So, evam kshamo bhajed viryam. Evam. Many of you will know this word. It is the first word of many of the Pali suttas. It's evam maya suttam, translated most frequently as thus have I heard. Literally, thus by me heard. Evam, thus maya, by me. And suttam, Pali, suttam, Sanskrit, shrutam, heard. It means thus, in that way. Evam here refers back to the previous chapter, chapter 6, which is the chapter on kshanti, which means forbearance, often translated as patience. But forbearance, the idea of just sitting calmly, whatever is thrown at you, you just sit and take it rather than reacting to it. That is essentially kshanti. So evam kshamo. So kshanti, the root ksham, let me just narrow the pencil a bit. The root ksham embodies this idea of patience, forbearance. The verbal noun, so ksham, kshamate, to be patient. The verbal noun is kshanti, the title of the previous chapter of the Bodhicaryavatara, and the adjective, the one who has this quality, is kshama. So the person is kshama. This is in the stem form. Normally when we cite a word, we give it in its stem form, and there is my separate YouTube video on what we mean by stems, roots and stems, which I advise you to look at because it does explain these words. So the stem form is kshama, and in the masculine singular, it is kshamah. So evam kshamah. Now the kshamah becomes kshamo by sandhi. Again, I've done a separate YouTube presentation on this aspect of sandhi, where the can become or does become o before a voiced consonant. So even kshamo, so kshamo, kshamah, it's the same word, but with the sandhi, the conjunction of the two words, the phonetic changes that take place depending on what follows. So even kshamo, thus patient or forbearing in this way, bhajed viryam. The root bhaj means essentially to devote oneself to practice, to engage in, often to engage in a practice for the development of a skill or a good quality. The past participle, meaning one who has engaged in or is engaged in or devoted to, many of you may know this, is bhakta. And many of you, and the verbal noun, which many of you may know, is bhakti. Bhakti often described as devotion. And we have bhakti yoga. There's Raja Yoga, Hatha Yoga, Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge, and Bhakti Yoga. The Bhakti Yoga is the yoga where the yoga of devotional yoga, it's sometimes translated, where the yogi, the practice of the yogi involves bhakti to a particular deity. So the person is a bhakta of that deity. But the primary meaning is just to apply yourself to something, to cultivate it. And it's in the optative form here. Optative is a bit like the subjunctive, which doesn't exist in classical Sanskrit. By the way, the subjunctive, it exists in Vedic as a separate mood. But bhajed does duty in classical Sanskrit, which we're dealing with here. The optative does duty for the subjunctive, and it's like a general exhortation or suggestion. Let one should, a general statement, one should develop. How's it? One should cultivate. And there's no particular subject to this verb. Used in this way as a general advice or recommendation just means one should. This is what should be done. So, evam kshamo, being forbearing in this way, bhajed viryam, let one cultivate virya. Virya bodhir yatah sthita. Yatah. Here we have an example, you'll be encountering them frequently. It means from which. It's the ablative, or the ablative of cause, from the root yad, meaning which, the relative which, means where from which. And it's used to convey because. It simply means because. But whereas because, in English we'd put because at the beginning of the sentence or phrase that it governs, in Sanskrit it doesn't come at the beginning, it comes in second or third place. So yata, putting this into an English word order, yata Bodhi sthita virya. Yata, because Bodhi, enlightenment, sthita, literally stood or is standing, is rooted, is dependent on, and it takes a locative virya, because Bodhi stands on virya. In other words, Bodhi is dependent on virya. Or to put it in other words, there will be no Bodhi without virya. There will be no enlightenment without the effort, without the virya, the effort, the energy, the vigor being put into it. Nahi viryam vina punyam. This sentence begins nahi. Na, not, and he is an emphatic. It is quite a common stylistic device in Sanskrit to start a negative sentence, particularly if you're making, a formal pronouncement, advising, teaching, and you're emphasizing not indeed, for it is not, that you start the sentence with nahi. So nahi viryam vina punyam. There is no, the verb is, or to be, is omitted here, which you're permitted to do. Just as in English we can say, there is no smoke, there is no smoke without fire. That can be shortened to no smoke without fire, which is regarded as a perfectly correct English sentence, because the verb to be there is understood. And this happens very frequently in Sanskrit and in Pali as well, that you omit the verb to be if it's understood. You can put it in, perfectly correct to omit it. So just as no smoke without fire is no punya without virya. Nahi viryam vina punyam. Vina is the equivalent of a preposition, though in English we have, and most European languages, we have prepositions, prepose, preposition means put in front, without, in, by, for, with, all these things are put in front of the noun that they govern. Sanskrit has postpositions. They do exactly the same duty as prepositions, except we call them postpositions because they occur after the noun that they govern. And just the same in the modern languages of northern India. I mean, the modern languages of India that are ultimately derived from Proto-Indo-European and Sanskrit. For example, in Hindi, the ghar, meaning a house, the word mein means in. To say in the house, you say ghar mein, house in. In India, Bharat mein. In Delhi, Dilli mein. So that is derived from the ancient way of putting it. So we don't, without virya, we don't say vina viryam, we say viryam vina. And this postposition vina, without, can govern either the instrumental or the accusative in this verse, without any distinction of meaning. In this verse, the writer, Shantideva, has used the accusative. So nahi viryam vina punyam. There is no punya without virya. You cannot get merit without making an effort. The merit depends on effort. No merit without effort. The word punya is frequently translated as merit, which is, again, it's a partial translation. It's a very inadequate translation. The word merit itself is from the merit. It's from the Latin merere, meaning to earn. It's something you've earned. It's almost like a commercial balance, a money balance. You do something and you've earned your merit, which is how in many Buddhist countries it's almost treated like that. You make merit, do something bad, and then you make up for it by putting to some meritorious deed that you build up your karmic bank account, put a bit of credit in there. But punya, so merit is basically meaning earnings. And for instance, the word emeritus, but the professor emeritus means that you've emeritus, earned out. In other words, he's done all of the duties that he's required to do. He's finished what he'd contracted to do. He's finished earning. He's still called a professor, but he's a professor emeritus, a professor who has completed all the work that he had to do. And indeed, the Pope emeritus, still called Pope, but he's the Pope emeritus, the Pope who has completed his earning. He's completed doing the duties. Now, punya, in Sanskrit written punya, and in Pali, punya. So the punya with this double tilde n derived from the punya, it is likely that it derives from a root pu, which is directly cognate with Latin purus and our English word pure. So punya is not so much making merit in this commercial sense that is inherent in the from merit from the Latin merere, Punya is more an act of purification, and probably the idea behind it is the purification of the bad karma, the purification of the defilements, the purification of all that is akushala. Akushala in Pali, kusala and akusala. In Pali, in Sanskrit, kushala. In fact, I think we encounter it in a verse or two beyond this. So kushala has the general sense of that which is good and beneficial, often translated as skillful or wholesome. Again, don't get fixated on a one-word translation. This is the semantic range that it embodies. In Buddhist usage, kushala is these mental states and conduct that are conducive towards the holy life. So punya, there is no punya. You cannot purify yourself, or to use the, what I think, very poor translation, you cannot make merit without virya. So I'll read this through once again, the entire verse slowly in Sanskrit. Evam kshamo bhajed viryam virye bodhiryatah sthita nahi viryam vina punyam yatha vayum vina gati. I'll just deal with a couple more roots that appear in this verse. There is va, to blow, and actually it is cognate with our word wind and the Latin ventus, which we have in English as ventilation, letting the wind blow through. It just means to blow, and the prefix, with the prefix nir, it can mean to blow out. So that is why the literal meaning, make it into a verbal noun, the literal meaning of nirvana is a blowing out. So here we are, the vana cognate with our Latin ventus and the English word wind. And from va, we have the noun vayu, that which blows, meaning the wind. So, and geti, from the root gum, which means to go, it's also actually directly cognate with our English word come, gum, come. It is slightly irregular because rather than conjugating as gamati, it doesn't do that, it's wrong. The m becomes a double ch, it becomes gachati. Gachati. He, she, it goes. The past participle is gata, meaning gone. So gata is directly cognate with our gone. Gate, gate, parang gate, and so on. And the tathagata, the sugata, is that same gata, of which the root meaning is gone. And you make a verbal noun, like you make many verbal nouns, by changing the final a of the past participle to an e. So gati, which is the last word in this verse, yata vayum vina gati. Gati literally means a going, cognate with our English word, English gate. Gait is your way of going, your gait, you're going. Gati has that same meaning, going. But here it means movement. Just there is no movement without the blowing of the wind. I think the imagery here is foliage, the leaves on trees. There is no movement unless there is the energy, the virya of the vayu, the energy of the wind blowing them. And finally, I'll just look at yata. Yata actually is the correlative of tata. Yata means as, or like, it's correlative with thus. Yata actually often correlates with evam. Sorry, tata often correlates with evam as well. We'll see that as we go along. So yata, so nahi viryam vina punyam. Nahi viryam vina punyam. There is no punya without virya. Yata, just as vayum vina gatim. Gati, sorry. Just as vayum vina gati, gati, motion, vayum vina, without wind, meaning just as there is no motion without wind. In the second half of this second verse, vayum vina gati, the nahi at the beginning of this line, nahi viryam vina punyam, there is no punya without virya. This nahi equally applies, it's not said again, but it equally applies to yata vayum vina gati, meaning nahi vayum vina gati. You very often find that in Sanskrit and Pali, that one verb or one expression like this nahi can apply separately to various expressions following it. It should be, in virtually every case, it should be entirely obvious. Good, that is it for this clip.